I have always wanted to write a book, and it was sort of interesting how I tried very hard in my early 30s. I had a similar idea. I wanted to write a dog book. I love dogs. I've trained dogs. I've had dogs. And, you know, they called to me, so it was a dream of mine to someday write a book. So about 20 years ago, I wrote a book, a children's book, with the dogs as a theme, and I guess at that point I didn't know how hard it was to write. It was a children's book, and at that point I really didn't know what I was in for. But as I learned about the publishing business, the more I learned, the more I thought, oh my gosh, this is really, really tough. The children's market is extremely difficult to break into. But I just thought, I'm going to write my story, and then I'm going to just see what happens. So I worked with a trainer, and when the book was done, I actually went to a Rosemont Writers Conference.
Oh.
And I tried to, you know, network, and I ended up hearing about a local children's writer. I called her up, and I said, okay, so how do you get this to a publisher? And she said, well, it takes a lot of perseverance. And she said, but I do know of someone that you could send, you know, she's a kind person, she'd be willing to look at your book. So to make a long story short, I did contact this woman who was an agent, and she basically said to me, you're better off sending it out yourself, because at this point, you know, you're no name, you know, nobody knew me. So I did that for a while, and she said, when you get a letter that says that they're interested, then you can call me. So I did that. I kept sending it out, and I finally heard back from publishers saying, yes, we're interested in this. We'd like you to maybe rewrite it. So at that point, that was my entry into getting an agent. And to make a long story short, it was a great help. I was really over the moon, thinking, okay, this is it. I'm going to get in. It went to Random House. They held it for 3 months, and then there was a takeover, and they shot it right out. And that was my first real slap in the face, I guess you'd call it. I just said, okay, I've had enough. I've had one too many rejections. So that was my first attempt, and my belief is, though, that if there's something inside of you that is still rolling around your head and keeps coming back to you, it's asking to be shared. So how many years later, 15 years later, I completely stopped writing at that point. I just said, I'm not doing this anymore. And then 15 years later, I started writing on the same topic, animals, because that was what was true for me. And I did have some experience working for a newspaper, and I became known as the animal writer, because they can send me to anyone, horses, dogs, or whatever, and I would come back with a good story. So that's where I got some experience, and then I started sending my stuff to the Philadelphia Inquirer in the travel section. I guess my real break was when I wrote a story about the Italian dogs, and this was, what, 2 years ago? Maybe?
I think it was 2 years ago, yeah.
And all of a sudden, it was on the front page of the travel section, and they published, I think, 14 of my photographs, and then everyone started to ask me, how did you do that? And, you know, really, it was, the beginnings started 20 years ago. So I believe there's a certain amount of persistence, that you just have to keep being persistent, and then once that happened, that's what led me to say, okay, I think I really have something to say here. I have sort of, Bruce was talking earlier about finding a unique angle that somebody else hasn't written about. So when I went to Italy, that's what I did, is I watched the dogs and their people, and I started to see stories. So then I started to introduce myself to the dogs and then the people. And they were very open, and they were wonderful, and they had great stories, and I was really having the time of my life for 2 weeks doing that. And then I came back and I wrote the individual little vignettes And then it all came together. And so that was the beginning of this idea that sometimes dogs have something to tell us. Sometimes they really have a story to tell. So my book is really about the dogs. And I would sometimes just stop in traffic and look out my window and see someone with a dog with their head hanging out the window, and I'd say, I think that dog, I know this sounds crazy, but I'd say that dog has something to say. So I literally would wave to the driver and say, could you pull over, please? I'd like to interview you. And I never had a bad experience. People would pull over, and I'd say, I really like your dog, and I have some questions for you. And people, I don't know, do I have any dog lovers here? Okay. Do you notice that you like to talk about your dog? Because it comes naturally, doesn't it? I mean, you don't hold back. It's
right.
It's my dog.
I would pull over and talk about that.
Yeah.
Right.
So that's really, I think that was my first interview for the book, was this woman in traffic. And I gained confidence. After she pulled over for me, I went to a shopping center in Paoli, and I was on my way into the Ritz Photo Center, and there's this woman walking this amazing looking dog that I couldn't figure out what it was. It almost looked like it had a human face. I mean, that's the only way I can describe it. Its eyes were this sort of greenish gold, and I looked at the dog, and the dog looked at me, and I said to the woman, I said, I've got to ask you about your dog here. Do you have a minute? And what do you think she said?
Of course.
I have more than a minute. So we sat down and we talked for about a half an hour. And while I was interviewing her, other people were actually coming over and saying, that's a very unusual looking dog. What is that breed? It's called a Spinoni. Anybody heard of that? I had never heard of this, and I've seen dogs all my life. Well, the thing that's unique about them is their eyes, and they're known for having almost a human eye. When they look at you, they zone in, and it's a very amazing feeling to be looking into the eyes of this dog. So, I don't know, maybe my time's up. I'm finding this is actually kind of fun.
We have plenty of time. You're good.
I think of myself as actually, really shy, but when it comes to dogs, there is something that I just get out of my comfort zone and I just go for it. I'm not afraid to ask sort of unusual questions. I did ask this woman, I said, I'm really curious now that you've told me all about your dog. I said, what do you do for a living? I'm just curious. And she said, I'm a canine bereavement counselor.
Aww.
And I mean, isn't that a perfect story? And she uses her dog her dog is present while she does therapy. So my book is 24 stories about dogs in this area. Some of the stories actually are not that just by chance. Like, I actually go to some of the rescues in the area, and I just go and I watch, I look at certain dogs, I may ask questions about a certain dog. I really just follow my instincts, and it usually takes me to something pretty interesting. I'll just tell one last story. This was probably the most surprising thing that happened. I went to New Hope because it's a very dog-friendly town. Have anybody been there?
Yes.
And do you notice the dogs are parading down that street? So I thought, this is going to be great. I'm going to, be able to pick a dog, and I'll have a beautiful backdrop of those old houses, because I take pictures of the dogs too. They're candids. But I thought, I just had this vision in my head of a dog with a historical house behind him. So I brought a friend along, and I'm going up and down the streets, and there's no dogs. So I went into a store and I said, isn't this town dog friendly? And the woman had such a good line. She said, we're dog friendly if the dog is friendly. We're friendly if the dog is friendly. So I said, well, I haven't seen any dogs. She said, well, that's unusual, but what can I say? So I went back out. I ended up having lunch with my friend, and as we're coming out, I see at the end of the sidewalk, off in the distance, I see, it looks like a couple, and they're walking their dog. So I run down the street, because I thought, this is my only chance here. And I asked her, I said, would you mind if I took a photo of you as a family? It looks like you have a lovely family here, you and she's with her partner, and this lovely dog. So she was more than happy to accommodate me. We set it up in front of one of those historical homes. I had a bench, I had it all looking nice. And then I thought I'd surprise her, and I'd say, I have this secret voice that I use to get the dog's attention. You being a photographer, you probably know sometimes you make noises and various other things.
Anything.
Anything that'll work. So,
Pets and children, anything.
yeah. So I said to her, I said, I'm just going to warn you that oh, feel free to come in. Taking over the show here. I said, I just want to warn you, I made a noise to get the dog to look at me. She said, oh, fine, fine. So I did my Donald Duck noise, and I'll do it for you now.
That was good.
That really worked.
Nice
And I got a great shot of the dog. And so I'm all done, and I just said to her, I said, you know, it's really strange that I have not seen any dogs, and I'm so happy that you were willing, and that, you know, that we ran into each other, literally. And she said, well, you know what, we just found out that they have closed down, the health inspector had come through town and closed down all of the restaurants with patios, and they were no longer allowing dogs onto the patios of the restaurants. And she was very disappointed, and I was too. And you know, so that became my story, because I did not like that. I think there were a lot of people that were going to be very disappointed, that were, you know, planning to go there because they could bring their dogs. There aren't that many places. So sometimes the unexpected would happen, and I just came to feel like, okay, I'm going to go with whatever happens. And so that's just a little bit about my book. And I'm very excited that it will be out probably in September. And my hope is that there's going to be an education element to the book. I feel like the more people learn, you know, about some of the issues like rescue, and some of the political stuff like towns not allowing dogs to be there, as opposed to Europe where they, you know, are much freer about those things. So each story is a little different, but I do try to have an educational component. There's definitely that was important to me. And at the end of my stories, I would give a website. If I was at a rescue or a training center, I give that information at the end of each story. So I think I've talked enough, but that was fun, and thank you for listening.